Today we're going to be talking about case management for transition and to facilitate transition for service users. This was a presentation, well, this is based on a presentation that I made back in October of 2009 to a group in Waterford, Ireland at an annual conference of the European Platform for Rehabilitation. And I thought that it would be interesting to look at and examine some of the issues that are unique to European countries and some of the definitions that are unique to European countries, and how I then integrated and brought about and talked about the approaches that we use in case management. So, there's my name. And this is the beginning of this presentation. The first thing that I talked about was giving an overview of disability. And rather than focus just on what our approach to disability is, what I thought to do would be to look at the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this is from Article 1 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it goes as follows. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. I don't think we would have any disagreement with this, and I think it would be consistent with our own thinking. Next, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities talks about the promotion of the full enjoyment by persons with disabilities of their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and a full participation by persons with disabilities will result in their enhanced sense of belonging and in significant advances in the human, social, and economic development of society and the eradication of poverty. It goes on to talk about the importance for persons with disabilities of their individual autonomy, and independence includes the freedom to make their own choices, which of course we would talk about in terms of empowerment, and that persons with disabilities should be actively involved in decision-making processes about policies and programs, including those directly concerning them. The importance of accessibility to the physical, social, economic, and cultural environment, to health and education, and to information and communication in enabling persons with disabilities to fully enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And in the European Union, which comprises much of Western Europe and Central Europe, they talk about 4 areas, one being access to equal rights or equal rights, finding and keeping jobs, education, and living independently. Again, all things that I believe that we certainly would agree with. Now, let me switch the focus and talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and the definition of who is a person with a disability. And again, this is part of what we function under, and the approach that we take. And under the ADA, as a refresher, a person with a disability is an individual who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities and has a record of such an impairment or is regarded as having such an impairment. Under the ADA employment provisions, as I'm sure you all know from other classes and from the work that you do, employers specify essential job functions, and these include The essential functions would be what a person must be able to perform in doing the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. And it's up to the employee to request a reasonable accommodation after a job offer has been made. And from the employer point of view, the requested accommodation must or does not create an undue hardship for the employer. Now, that's a little vague in terms of what would be or what would constitute an undue hardship, but in any event, that part of it relates to the employer. And it's also important to understand that the accommodation would basically enable the person to perform an essential or the essential job functions, and that it would not create that undue hardship. Disability, however, in the United States, as I believe we have talked in other classes, is basically or is essentially a legal definition. And we function in rehabilitation programs, in programs that can be construed as either entitlement programs or eligibility programs. And let's talk a little bit about the difference between an entitlement and an eligibility program. And I've listed a number of programs, different programs that have different definitions of disability, including the public rehabilitation program, obviously known as state rehabilitation services, worker compensation, long-term disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act has its own definition. Social Security disability programs have their own definitions. And depending upon what area of proprietary or private rehabilitation, there will be a different definition of what a disability is. Now, in terms of eligibility and entitlement, is the public rehabilitation program an entitlement program or an eligibility program? Well, it's actually an eligibility program. A person has to meet the eligibility criteria in order to receive services. And of course, under the mandates of Congress, the state rehabilitation programs are required to serve the persons with the most severe or significant disabilities first. So a person has to meet the eligibility requirements and then is put into a priority regarding severity of disability. And if a state can't serve everybody who applies or who is eligible, then there has to be an order of selection. Now, is worker compensation and long-term disability, are those entitlement or eligibility programs? Well, those are entitlement programs. If you work for somebody and you have an injury, then you are entitled to whatever benefits would be available under that program. In worker compensation, it's based on a work injury. In long-term disability, if someone has a long-term disability policy, then it's basically based on the person being unable to perform the work that he or she was doing. And so basically, those programs are entitlement programs. You're entitled to rehabilitation services if you are covered under worker compensation or a long-term disability policy. Social Security disability programs, those are based upon basically eligibility. A person has to meet the eligibility criteria. Now, Social Security is an entitlement program. This retirement Social Security is an entitlement program. If you work and you pay into Social Security, then at whatever the age is, and the age changes, It starts at 62, but it can I believe go up now to 67. Whatever your age is, and that's based on when you were born and as well as whether you want full or partial benefits. Regular retirement Social Security is based on entitlement. You pay into the system, and then at a certain age, you are entitled to get money back from the system. Whereas if you become disabled and you paid into the program, you have to meet the eligibility criteria. And basically the eligibility criteria is that a person has one or more physical or mental impairments which prevent the person from being able to engage in a significant number of jobs which exist in the competitive labor market, and that disability is expected to last for at least 12 months or result in death. So a person may have a disability, but that disability may not prevent the person from being able to perform a substantial number. They may still be able to perform a substantial number of jobs, in which case the person would not be found as meeting the eligibility requirements of Social Security. But to contrast that with worker compensation, in worker compensation or long-term disability, a person may have an injury or an impairment, but the person can still do the work that he or she was doing. So the benefits that they would have, they would still be eligible for rehabilitation, maybe physical therapy or lost time wages. So they are entitled to that. They don't have to meet an eligibility standard. It's not based on some sort of eligibility. It's just you have a disability, you're then entitled to services. And as we know, the basic concept in public rehabilitation with regard to eligibility is that the person has a physical or mental impairment which interferes with the ability to perform work activities, and through the provision of rehabilitation services, the person can be assisted in terms of employment and independent living services. So that's a very general definition, and it's not initially based on severity, but to receive services, the severity of disability would need to be determined. So each of these areas is somewhat different, and each of these areas is based on some different concepts and has different definitions of disability. And that's why I said disability in the U.S. Is basically a legal term, and programs that we may work in are based on entitlement or eligibility, and sometimes it's a combination, but usually one is primary, and then you get to the next one. You might be entitled, you might be eligible but not entitled, or entitled but not eligible. Okay. But typically, if you're entitled to a program and you get injured, then you're automatically eligible, typically. Private for-profit rehabilitation programs would come under the rubric of worker compensation and long-term disability. Now, I kind of veer off here and talk about some other values and other issues, and I've labeled this social inclusion. First, social inclusion includes the concept of supported employment and the concept that all people can work. Social inclusion includes community-based assessment and training. It includes a reduction and elimination of physical, social, and environmental barriers. It looks at our societal values with regard to the nature of society and the nature of disability and the rights of people with disabilities. And social inclusion considers the relationship of the individual with a disability to society. On the next slide, we look at, well, we would think about what are the values, attitudes, and expectations in society. Do we value people with disabilities? And that can be reflected or measured, in our instance, in terms of passing legislation such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, which addresses or talks about full inclusion and participation of people with disabilities in society. So we have values, attitudes, and expectations in general in society, but then we also, as professionals, have to look at family and cultural values and attitudes. You know, what are the values that we have been raised with? What are the values in our social group? Do we value education? Do we value working? Do we value participation in society? And of course, we're probably all going to answer yes, but when we work with consumers, we have to see, does the consumer have support for those values? Do families encourage participation in rehabilitation programs, or do they sometimes stand in the way? Do they sabotage the programs that we're doing? We also have to look at the physical, the social, and sensory accessibility. Are the environments in which we work accessible? Are the environments in which we function and consumers will function, do they allow for and welcome participation in society? Are public transportation systems accessible? Are buildings accessible? If our government agencies, are they accessible? And I think for the most part today, we're going to be able to answer those questions yes. That wasn't always the case. When we look in, and there are many buildings that still are not accessible. And when we look into employment and employers or training programs, we can ask the same questions. You know, what is the degree of accessibility? What is the degree of acceptance? What is the degree of welcoming of people with disabilities into employment or into a training program or an educational institution? We have to think about community employment and supported employment. We have to think about the degree to which we have programs that encourage people to be employed and encourage people to be able to participate in society. We have to look at mobility and transportation issues, the degree to which programs are accessible, the degree to which there is access to not just transportation, but appropriate transportation, that somebody can get to and from a job or to and from a training program. And we also have to look at independent living, issues such as self-care and self-direction. Those are also important issues that we focus on. As professional counselors, we have to look at the concepts of case management. And how do we define disability? How do we determine the disability of a person? We determine disability by objective testing, physical, mental testing, vocational, educational testing. We think about the medical versus the functional model of disability. We can substitute social for functional. We can talk about medical versus the social model of disability. And what is the difference? Well, the difference is in the medical model, we're looking at the physical and mental abilities of the person, but when we address the social model of disability, the functional model of disability, what we're also adding in here is how does the person, with regard to his or her level of functioning, how is the person able to, and to what degree is the person able to be involved in activities in society, in educational programs, in employment programs. And so we look at, we focus, our approach is understanding the medical aspects of disability, medical meaning psychological and physical, but then how do we then translate that and those factors and not look at those just in a vacuum, but how do we translate those into how the person actually functions, based on that information. And that's where we get into the concept of the functional or the social model of disability. Obviously, for some programs, the eligibility is based on, or entitlement is based on the medical model. Medical model being, do you have a disability, the extent of the disability, and if the answers to that are yes, and then determining the extent of the disability and the limitations the disability presents to the person, then the person may be eligible. Other programs, primarily service delivery programs, eligibility is based on the person's function, the relationship and interaction between the person and the social and physical environment, which would mean the impact of the disability on the individual. In case management, what we're looking at is to assist the individual achieve his or her highest level of functioning commensurate with physical and mental abilities, personal, family, environmental, and societal factors. So what we are looking at in a case management model and in a case management program is assisting, helping the individual through counseling and through career planning and through plan development and identification of the IPE, Individual Plan for Employment. What we're looking at is the application of that knowledge to helping the person determine career goals and vocational rehabilitation outcomes, and then implementing a plan of service to address the presenting issues the person has and the vocational goal that the person has identified, and to determine what those services and programs would be that would adequately and appropriately address the issues and the areas that were identified in the IPE. So what we come down to is that rehabilitation and what we do in case management, and that is a planned, orderly sequence of services and practices and events to meet the needs of the individual in order to assist the person achieve his or her employment and independent living goals. So again, what we're doing in rehabilitation is understanding the physical, mental factors of the person, and we're then applying those to personal, family, environmental, social, societal issues, which would be the social model of disability, and determining with the person, having the person determine a career and vocational goal, vocational outcome, and translating that into an individual plan for employment, which would then get into that planned, orderly sequence of practices, services, and events to meet the needs of the person, to assist that person in achieving his or her employment and independent living goals. And that in rehabilitation is an outcome-oriented system designed to meet the needs of the individual. So it's very important that we individualize the programs and the services that we provide. And this is where our individual counseling comes in. This doesn't mean that as part of the planning process we neglect others in the person's environments, but it means that we look at each person as a unique individual who has a different configuration of backgrounds, of educational functioning, prior employment, if any, environmental factors, family factors, social factors that go into our understanding of the individual. And I do believe that although the focus is on the consumer and client rights and choice and empowerment, in order to help do that, it's also important for us to bring in and to work with significant others who are part of the person's family and influence situation, because we might do excellent work, and we might be very effective in what we do, but we might find that the work that we do is being sabotaged by others, and that undermines what it is that we are trying to accomplish. As professional counselors, and your counseling courses are the techniques and the theories class, where you learn about theories of counseling and then techniques of counseling. But basically what we're looking at is we are attempting to, and we must, establish rapport with consumers, emphasizing them as co-participants in the rehabilitation process. And I think I left off one thing here on this last slide, which I think is very important before I get to the next slide, but that is consumers, to me, are responsible for managing their rehabilitation and employment and independent living goals and outcomes. Now, having said that, I also recognize that different people function at different levels, and not everybody is able to function at the same level of independent living and management of the program that other people are. So everyone is different. So, but I do believe that the extent to which we can help people be able to be responsible for their rehabilitation program and employment outcome, that is a desirable outcome for us. So, having said that, we can then move into what I was talking about, that in order to be successful, and in order to be successful as a counselor, that it's incumbent on us to be able to establish rapport with our consumers. If we don't do that, if we don't have good rapport, then the environment for successful counseling is probably not going to be met, and it's probably going to become more problematic that the person will actually be successful in completing a rehabilitation program. That consumers who develop the trust in us, who see that we respect them, who see that we're interested in understanding who they are, who sense that we have good empathy and that we want to work with the individual, those are persons who are more likely than others to be successful. And if we don't do that, and people are still successful, it may be in spite of our inability to establish that rapport. As professionals, we, through our counseling, assist consumers with examining their abilities and training and career opportunities, and we assist consumers in clarifying values and defining rehabilitation goals and outcomes. And for us, a question that's important to answer, which is part of the landscape of rehabilitation these days, is the question of, can all people work? And that's a question that you can look at with regard to all people working in terms of not just competitive employment, but in a supported employment model as well, where you structure the work in a way that people can work in enclaves or work groups or with a job coach, or in carving out a job for people that may go beyond the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I think for us in rehabilitation, in public rehabilitation, is an important factor to understand. So let me just very briefly describe that for us. The requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act are that the employer establishes the essential functions, as we've talked, and an individual says, yes, I can do those essential functions, but I need an accommodation, which if a person needs the accommodation, and some people say, I can do the work, I don't need any accommodation, but if the person needs the accommodation, then it's up to the employer, then the ball's back in the employer's court to say that that is reasonable or that is not reasonable, or work something out along those lines. What we can do in public rehabilitation is that we can work with employers, and we can go beyond just that standard. We can work with employers to modify jobs or to sculpture jobs or to take pieces of different jobs and put them together in order to assist somebody be able to work at that employment site. And that can go beyond the way the job is typically performed and go beyond the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We, as professionals, assist consumers to be able to identify changes needed to achieve goals, to clarify changes that need to achieve goals. Change, it can be very difficult. People can have kind of an approach avoidance to participation in rehabilitation. The approach might be, when I use that term, approach avoidance, approach might be, yes, I'm the consumer, I want to go be retrained, I want to go to work, I want to be self-sufficient, I want to have independence. But the avoidance might be, but I'm afraid, what if I don't succeed? I know what I have now, I'm going into an unknown, and what happens if I get a job but then I can't do it or I lose it? Then what happens? So frequently consumers have this approach avoidance model running through their thinking, and it's up to us to help people, and this is where rapport comes in, to help people feel comfortable in and feel supported in proceeding with a rehabilitation program. And that's where effective counseling comes in, to encourage people to take charge of their rehabilitation program and to examine the issues that might be pushing the person towards retraining and job placement and employment, and those other forces, counter forces, that are pulling the person away from that would be barriers, because it may take somebody out of their comfort zone, or it may put somebody into an unknown area, and people might say, well, I know what I have, and this potentially puts me into something I don't know. So those are things that we need to address. We also need to identify, examine, use, and evaluate different strategies to assist consumers. I think we work with a variety of consumers. Each person presents, as I was saying, individual and unique configurations of strengths and weaknesses, backgrounds, ages, education, gender, ethnicity, racial issues, identity, geographic location, everything. Everybody's different. Employment, prior employment, education, support systems, everything in each person is different. And to fully understand what each person is addressing, the issues that need to be looked at for each person, it's important for us to look at different counseling strategies in order to do that. And having good rapport, having trust, being empathetic, then allows us to assist consumers with the implementation of rehabilitation goals and objectives. And in order to do that, we develop and implement effective counseling techniques and procedures to help the consumer be successful, and so that everything that we do would be designed to help the person succeed. Let's make sure I got all of that. Yes, we did. What we also do in case management is we work with transition from school, from institution or home to independent living, economic self-sufficiency, and those would then enhance the person's quality of life. We examine with the person the barriers, as I was talking, the facilitators, the incentives, the disincentives to successful rehabilitation, successful employment, successful independent living, and self-sufficiency. And those are part of the counseling issues that become critical if we are to be able to help somebody that somebody develops an awareness of these issues, so that if there are doubts, if there are barriers, if there are disincentives, that we can help the individual process those and understand those, and in doing so address those issues, so that the person can then make informed choices and move forward. And we assist consumers to transition from being dependent, that should be, transition to being independent, that's correct, and full participants in society. Going along with that prior slide where I talked about the notion of what rehabilitation is, we have rehabilitation as an input process and outcome service delivery model. In our functional, our social model of rehabilitation, we collect information, collect medical, physical functioning information, educational, employment, school information about the individual. We help the person set vocational goals. We help the person make informed choices based on information, objective information. We look at subjective factors with regard to what the person believes he or she can and can't do. We try to reconcile discrepancies between what the person feels able to do and the information that we may have, which may suggest that the person can function at higher levels than what the person believes. And we then set goals, objectives, and with the person, and this is all as co-participants with the person, so that the person has a positive employment outcome through an IPE, an individual plan for employment. In our process stage, we're helping to implement the plan, service delivery. We identify educational services, physical, mental services needed for the person, GED obtainment if the person doesn't have a GED. We may identify various therapeutic modalities, work adjustment training, employability skills, helping people develop job-seeking skill, information and knowledge, resume writing, being able to know how to search for jobs, know how to interview, grooming, and so forth. Outcome is where we assist the person with going into employment. We assist the person with being able to deal with and understand issues that may arise in working in the employment site. And as you know, many times, in many cases, when people lose jobs or leave jobs, they do so not because they can't do the work, but because of interpersonal issues at work. So we would deal with interpersonal issues as part of the employment adjustment process. We help the person transition into independent living, economic self-sufficiency, and social inclusion. Employment transition consideration include the necessary school-to-work transition services, working with school personnel, training and education and employment services, working with education and training programs, and helping persons transition from government support, such as being on Social Security disability or supplemental security income, to economic self-sufficiency and independent living, to look at case management services and functions necessary for persons with developmental disabilities, with gradual and sudden onset disabilities. And those relate to considerations related to habilitation, which would be the domain primarily of individuals with developmental disabilities, where the person's never known a certain level of functioning, to rehabilitation considerations or relearning or readjustment or retraining for persons who have had gradual and sudden onset disabilities, and the psychological and social factors surrounding persons with developmental disabilities or gradual and sudden onset disabilities can be unique. and can be also influenced by all those other factors that I've mentioned previously in this segment, including age, support system, prior education, prior employment, gender issues, environmental issues, geographic issues, issues of ethnicity, all the issues that are involved in understanding who the person is. And then in case management, we identify different functions, including, and I'll go into detail on these in the next series, next class meetings, of work tolerance, of mobility, work skills, self-direction, communication, interpersonal skills, self-care, and attendant factors. And these are all factors that we as professionals determine, and we implement these with regard to being able to make a determination as to eligibility and severity of disability. And we rely upon background information supplied to us by the person through self-report, by significant others through self-report, as well as by the information that we have, the existing information we have from medical records, school records, hospital records, and any other information that we may generate through sending the person out for vocational evaluations or psychological evaluations or medical evaluations. And then finally today, it's important for us to remember that vocational rehabilitation is an outcome-oriented program, with the outcome being successful and positive employment outcome, independent living, and quality of life issues. And we look at, in evaluating rehabilitation programs, the extent to which independent living, employment, self-sufficiency, and social inclusion goals are met. And we evaluate our programs at the macro level, meaning the overall success and effectiveness of our program, and the micro level, how successful was the individual in terms of achieving goals. And we do summative and formative evaluations on our process and our outcome, summative evaluations being looking at how the person is doing as the person proceeds and goes along. That's formative. Formative evaluation is looking at how the person has succeeded in the process as the person moves through the program, and how successful programs are in terms of achieving goals. Summative evaluation would be the end result evaluation, the final evaluation of the overall rehabilitation program. So that, in summary, is the presentation about case management that I gave in October 2009 to a group of European Union rehabilitation personnel, and we'll be covering some of these other areas in other classes, other lectures in this class, and looking at cases and looking at forms and procedures in this class. So that's today's lecture. You have other reading materials and other exercises to do.